Hey, I'm Hunter from SkillThrive, and in this video, I'm going to show you how to implement passwordless login in a React application using Firebase. Here's a look at what you'll build. Tune in to the end of the video if you want to learn more about our new Firebase Authentication Guide, which goes in depth on how you can build an email password authentication with form validation, reCAPTCHA, style components, toaster notifications, and a custom reset password flow. For now, you can find the code in the description below if you'd like to follow along. Let's get started. The first thing we need to do is to go ahead and create a new Firebase project, and we do that by going to firebase.google.com and then creating an account if we don't already have one. Then what we need to do is head into the console and then click here to create a new project. We can give this project any name we want. And then click on continue. You can enable Google Analytics if you'd like, but I'm just going to turn it off and then click on create project. And this will just take a couple moments for Firebase to create a new project. Once Firebase is done, we can go ahead and click on continue. And now what we need to do is go ahead and create a new app right here from this home screen. And we're building one for the web, so we want to select this one right here. Then what we can do is go ahead and name our app. And then click on register app. And for now, I want to keep this up because we're going to be using these values and storing them in our environment variables in our React project. But for now, let's go ahead and head to our terminal and create our project using create React app. The first thing I want to do is head to where I want to put my project. Then I want to run a command to create a React app using create React app. We can actually pass in a flag called template, which is going to allow us to use a template when we're building our React application. And the template we're using is one for Chakra UI, which is going to give us some out-of-the-box UI elements, as well as some really cool ways to manage a dark and light mode theme out of the box. So what we can do in order to do this is just go ahead and run the following command. So yarn create React app, then the name of your app, so whatever, and then dash template, then at Chakra, make sure I spelled that right, -UI. And then go ahead and hit return for that to go ahead and build our React application. All right, so once that's done, we need to go ahead and open our project, and that is going to be in Firebase Auth video. Then we can run the command code period. And this is something if you're using a Mac and you're using VS Code. This isn't going to work out of the box. You actually have to set this up, and I'll link something in the description if you don't have this already set up. So once we have that, we can see now that we have VS Code opened up. So I'm just going to go ahead and maximize this. I'm going to go into the source and go ahead and get rid of some stuff we don't need. I don't need the logo.js file or the logo SVG. And let's go into our app, and let's just go ahead for now and get rid of all of this and just have a p tag that says hello, and then just get rid of all of this right here. All right, so the next thing we want to do is we want to go ahead and create a file called .env.local, which is going to hold our environment variables here in our React application. So let's go ahead and create a new file here. .env.local. And the way you want to name these is you want to first start off with in all caps React_app, and then another underscore, and then the name of the variable. Now the reason you do this is by naming it like this, create React app is going to know that this is an environment variable, and then it's going to make wherever you use these environment variables, you're just going to make them accessible in your code on the front end. So the first one we want to do is we want to create one called, I'm going to do FB for Firebase and then API. Then I want to go back to that screen here and then copy this API key, head back and then paste it in. And then I'm just going to do that for the next one. So let's just do FB domain, just so you make sure you have a hang of it. copy this and then go back. And I'm just going to go ahead and skip forward into the video where we have all of these completed. All right, so once we have all of those values in our environment variable folder, we can go ahead now and save our .env local file. The next thing we want to do is you want to go ahead and create a custom hook called useAuth. And this is going to hold all of our methods. It's going to create the context in the provider, which we can wrap our application around, which is going to pass that auth user object and methods. So components further down the tree can get access to them by just using the useAuth custom hook. Now, before we do that, let's head back into Firebase. And we actually have to set up authentication into our new Firebase project. So the first, click on Continue to Console. And now that we're in this Firebase password auth application, we need to come over here and click on Authentication. Then click on Get Started. We want to come over here and select Email and Password, click this little Edit. We want to enable it, and we also want to enable passwordless sign-in. Now it's going to tell you that there's some additional steps, which I'll cover in this video, so don't worry about this little pop-up, and then just click on Save. All right, so this is enabled and we should now be able to actually use this in our code. So let's head back into our code here. And in the source, I'm going to create a new folder and I'm going to call this hooks. And inside here, I'm going to create a new file called useauth.js. And inside here, the first thing we want to do is just go ahead and import everything we need. Now, the first stuff we need is just going to be coming from React. So we need React. We're going to import useState, useEffect, useContext, and createContext. And that's all coming from React. Now the next thing we need to do is we need to import or install Firebase in our terminal. So let's do Control backtick to open up our terminal here in VS Code. And then run yarn add Firebase. All right, so once that is installed, let's go ahead and import everything we need from Firebase. So that's going to be imports Firebase from Firebase/app. And then we need to also import Firebase/auth. Then let's go ahead and add a little note here, initialize Firebase. And we're going to call Firebase, which is what we imported. And there's a method called initializeApp. And this is going to take in a couple values here, which we stored on our environment variable. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy the values that we need. You'll notice that it's the same ones that were in that little dialog box when we first created our application. But what we did is instead of just passing these in here into our code, which is dangerous because you don't want these to be exposed in our, if we committed this to GitHub, we stored them here in the environment variable, and we can get it by reading off of process.env and then the name of the variable that we have in our env.local file. All right, so once that is initiated, the next thing we want to do is we want to create some context, which is going to allow us to create a provider, which will wrap around our application and provide the values and the methods that this useAuth hook is going to need. So to create context, it's really easy. We just go ahead and create a new constant called auth context, and just call that method that we got from React called createContext. Then I'm going to just add a little note here for what the next step is for. So we want to export a constant called useAuth, which is what we're going to be calling. And what this is going to do is it's going to return the hook called useContext, and then we have to tell it what context to use, which is just the one that we just created. So auth context. Then we want to go ahead and create a new note here. This is also going to be exported, and it's going to be the Auth Provider. This we're going to pass in children, and the reason we're doing this is because we're wrapping it around our application. So anything this is wrapped around is going to be the children, and that needs to be rendered in between this Auth Provider, and that'll make more sense once we actually wrap our application. So the next, first thing we want to do in this Auth Provider is to create a state for our user. So we set that called user. The function to call to change that state is set user, and that's going to be equal to the use state hook that we get from React. And then we set a default value here called null. Then there's another value called is authenticating, and set is authenticating. And then this is also going to be use state. And by default, this is going to be true. Now, the reason we have to do this is because later in the video, we're going to create a private route, which is going to check if a user is null. And if it is null, it's going to just redirect that person back to login. Now, the issue is that it takes a minute for it to go off to Firebase to check if the user's logged in. So the user by default is going to be null, and it's automatically going to redirect them to login even if they're logged in already. So by handling this state here, we can conditionally render the children and say, is this authenticating? If it is, don't render it yet. But once this is false, we can actually go ahead and render the children. So you'll see that once we actually export the provider below. Now, the next thing we want to do is go ahead and create all the methods that we were going to be using throughout our application. There's just a couple here. So const, and I like to name these whatever they're called in Firebase. So this is called send sign in link to email. This takes an email as an argument. And then all it's going to do is return Firebase.auth. And there's a method on here called send sign in link to email. Again, this takes the email as an argument and also a couple values here for options. The first one is the URL that we want Firebase to redirect back to, and this URL needs to be in your domains. So if we go back into Firebase, into authentication, into sign-in method, and then scroll down, you'll see this authorized domains. Localhost is already enabled by default, so you might want to turn this off once this is in production. But wherever you host this, you want to make sure you add this that domain as an authorized domain, or this isn't going to work. So that's the reason we can go ahead and use localhost right here. So localhost, we got to do HTTP. Localhost, and that's going to be on 3000 because that's where our app will be hosted in development, and then a page called confirm. Next, we need to pass in another value here called handle code and app, and that's going to be true. And this is going to return a promise. So what we can do is go ahead and chain on .then, and this is going to get a response back, which in this case, all we're going to do is just return true, meaning that, hey, this ran successfully. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to the next method. I have a little typo here. Okay, let's go ahead and save that. Move on to the next method, which is going to be called sign in with email link. That is going to take in two values, one called email and one called code. And the code is technically, it's going to be a URL string, but I think code's a little easier to understand. And this is going to do something very similar. So it's going to return a call to Firebase. So Firebase .auth. Then the method on here is going to be called sign in with email link. And this is going to take those two values as arguments, so email and code. Then we're going to chain on then, because it's going to return a promise. And then we're going to get a result here that we can pass in and actually set on our user state. So this is going to be result. And the value we want to set here is on result.user. So we can say set user, calling that method to change our state, passing in that result. And there's an object on that result called user with all the user information that comes from Firebase. So once that's done, we can go ahead now and just return true. So you complete this method. All right, so let's go ahead and save that. And the last method here we're going to be writing is one called log out. And this is a very simple one. So log out takes no arguments. And all it's going to do is return a call to Firebase to log out. But it is, at the end, going to set user to null. So let's go ahead and save that. All right, so now what we want to do is we want to create a use effect, which is going to listen to auth changes on mount, and then it's going to make sure that the user state is always up to date with the most up to date user from Firebase. And there's a method called onAuth state change that's going to make that a lot easier for us to handle in our application. So what we need to do is go ahead and use that use effect hook. And actually, before we do that, let's add a note here so we can explain what's going on here. And I'm just going to copy this from the final code. Then let's go ahead and call our use effect. And this is going to run when the component mounts. So we need to pass in this empty array of dependencies. And first, we're going to define a function up here called unsubscribe. It's going to be firebase.auth, and then the method that we're going to call is onAuth state changed. This is going to get access to a value called user, which is going to come back to us, and then we can go ahead and set user to that user value. And we also want to change is authenticating to false. So we say set is authenticating to false. All right, so we define the function, and what we're going to do is we're going to call the function in the useEffects cleanup. And what this is going to do is it will cause any component, which we noted here, that utilizes this hook to re-render with the latest auth object. And the way we have and write cleanup functions in useEffect is just writing this return. And we can just go ahead and call that function here, unsubscribe. So let's go ahead and just add a note. Okay, so now that we have that, the next thing we want to do is go ahead and move on to exporting our Auth Provider, which is going to be what we actually wrap our app with. But before we do that, we want to go ahead and create a constant called values, which is going to hold all the values here that we just created. One is going to be for user, next one is authenticating, and then all of our methods. All right, so once we have that, we can go ahead and create the provider by saying return. And then we have the auth context dot, and then we can have provider. And this has to take in an argument called a value, and that value is whatever we want to get access to in this provider. So in this case, it's going to be the values, this constant that we just created. Then we want to go ahead and render the children. But remember, we only want to render this if it's not authenticating. So is authenticating false, and then if it is, we can go ahead and render the children. So let's go ahead and save that. And there we go. Now we have this useAuth completed. And just to give credit where credit's due, there's this really awesome website called useHooks. And they have a ton of different hooks here. And I actually got the idea for this hook somewhere right here, this useAuth. And this is the one similar to the one that I actually use in the final project. But this one doesn't use that state value, which at first you're like, okay, my app's working. But once you refresh a page that should be on a private route, you'll realize that you'll need that. So mine is a little more up to date, but it's still very similar. And cool. So now we got that out of the way. Let's go ahead and move on to some of our components. So let's go ahead and create a new file here called folder. And then in here, we'll create a new one called components. Then we'll create a layout component. So layout.js. And this layout component is going to be just a general grid that's going to wrap our application. So let's go ahead and write that code. So let's import React. We're going to, I don't know what that was all about. We're going to import grid from Chakra. We're also going to import the colored mode switcher, which comes out of the box when we're using that theme, that template from Chakra UI. Now, right now, it's just sitting here in our source folder. So I'm actually going to move it into our layout. And I actually forgot to create a new folder here. So let's create a new folder called layout, and then drop both of these in here. Okay, and then we go ahead and import that, that component. And this is what's going to give us that really cool way to toggle dark and light mode in our app. Okay, so let's go ahead and create this component. Again, this is going to be passed in children. So anything we wrap this in is just going to be right here. And all this is going to do is it's going to return a grid. And we're going to pass in the color mode switcher. And we're also going to pass in some styles into this. So position is absolute. Top is going to be a value of 0. Or excuse me, not 0, but 3. And right is also going to be a value of 3. So if we go ahead and close that off, and then what we want to do is just make sure we render the children right here. Now this grid, we're also going to be passing in some values here in order to create the grid that we want. And what we're going to do is create a 3-column grid. Now the way we can do that with some other values here is just by defining some props, which you can get off of the Chakra documentation. One is called min h, which is for min height. This is going to be set to 100 VH, or 100% of the view height. So whatever the height is for our screen, we're just going to tell this grid to take up that full space. Then what we want to do is set template columns. And this is going to take a function called repeat, which we can use in CSS. We're going to say create 3 columns and create them as 1 FR. So what this does, if you've never seen fraction units, is it's going to look at the space that's available. And if we're saying 3 1 FR, it's essentially writing 1 FR like this. So 3 times, which means create 3 columns that are all equal sizes. So if we want the middle one to be twice as big as the other, we can do something like that. And now the middle column is twice as big as the other 2. So that's how the fraction unit works. It's a nice responsive way to create columns. So as our screen resizes, CSS is going to figure out how big those columns should be. All right, so template rows, we're going to set to max content. And what this means is that whatever is in that row, only set that row height to as big as it needs to be in order to fit the content. So that's what the max content does. Then we can set a gap to a value of 6. And you might be wondering, where do these values come from? So gap 6, padding 6. Well, they're coming from, if we go into Chakra UI, and let's actually look up Chakra UI default theme. And look up the breakpoints, or excuse me, not breakpoints, but spacing. You can see here by default, all these values we pass in. So if we pass in 3, what this really translates to is 0.75 rem. So this is just as a reference. In case you're curious what the 3 value is, just refer back to the Chakra docs in order to see what that default value is. All right, so the p tag is, or the p prop is going to be for padding. So we're adding 3, a value of 3, all the way around our grid. All right, so let's go ahead and save that. And now what we can do is make sure we export it, export default layout. And now let's go ahead and just wrap our application, go ahead and boot it, and then we should be able to see our Chakra app with the little toggle, and we can toggle the light and dark mode, and that will be getting us started in the right direction. So like I said, let's head to app, import our layout. Then on this return, we can just go ahead and render layout. Okay, then let's go ahead and run yarn start. Okay, so we got an error here because we forgot to save this file. So let's go ahead and save it. Okay, so we got that as a success now. So the reason it's not working is because we haven't wrapped our application with the Chakra Provider, which is going to give it access to all of those theme values. So that's the reason this isn't working. So what we want to do is head into our index.js file, and we need to go ahead and import from Chakra UI the Chakra Provider and the theme. And that's going to be coming from at Chakra React UI. All right, so once we do that, we can go ahead and in this app here, we can just go ahead and wrap it with, whoops, I accidentally imported that. I didn't need to. We need to do the Chakra Provider. Wrap that around our app so it has context to it, and then pass in as a value theme, and then the theme that we imported as well from Chakra. So now if we save that and go back, we'll see if we refresh it, everything looks as expected. And now this little toggle button works as well. So we get this really cool dark mode out of the box. All right, so now that we have that, the next thing we want to do is create a nav for our application. So let's go back into the layout, create a new file, and call this nav.js. And in here, let's go ahead and do the usual imports from React. We're going to be importing a couple things from Chakra UI. One is called grid item, box, flex, and text. And then we're also going to be importing something called link, which is a component from React Router DOM. Now, we haven't installed React Router DOM yet. So let's go ahead now and do yarn add React Router DOM. And React Router DOM is the package we're going to be using in order to handle all the routing in our application. So for example, when someone goes to our website /login, they'll take to and be seen, they're going to be able to see the login component. So we'll set that all up here in a couple moments. But for now, we're going to be using a component called link, which is going to handle the routing. Once someone clicks on this, it's going to send them over to whatever page that we pass in as a prop. All right, so that's done there in the imports. So let's go ahead, or in our terminal rather, and let's go ahead and import link from React Router DOM. And the last thing we want to import is that custom useAuth hook. All right, so now we can go ahead and create our component. And while we're at it, let's go ahead and export it. And let's go ahead now and get some of those values off of our useAuth. So we're going to get the user in the logout function from calling useAuth. Then we're going to go ahead and write our return here. And the first thing we want to do is set a grid item. Now, remember, because we're wrapping this in a layout, it's going to be on a grid, so we have to tell that grid item where it needs to be on the grid. So that's exactly what this component does from Chakra. So let's say grid item, column start. So where do we want it to start? We want it to start on column 1, so the first one, and then we want column span, how many columns it should stretch across, to be 3, which is all of the columns. And then we just go ahead and give this some padding value of 3. Let's just go ahead and close that off. Then we're going to use a flex component, which adds flexbox to a div. And that doesn't take any more arguments. And then what we can do is we conditionally render things by checking if the user exists. So we say user, and if the user exists, we can go ahead and render something here. What we want to render are things that only a signed in person should see. So first I'm going to do a fragment. Then we're going to use that link, and the prop we pass in is called to, and that's going to send it to the home page. And inside here, we use the text component, set a font size to medium, and a margin right to a value of 8. And then inside here, this is just going to say dashboard. Then what we're going to do is we're going to create something that looks like a button, but it's actually going to be a div. And if you read the Chakra UI, they suggest that you need a functionality of a button, but you don't want to use a button, you can use the box, which is just a div, and you can pass in a prop called as, so rendering it as a button, and then on click, you can go ahead and just pass in that on click that you want to use. So in this case, we're just calling that logout function that we got from our useAuth. Okay, so this is going to just render out some text. So I'm just going to copy this, paste it here, and that is going to say logout. All right, so now that we have that, what we can do is below here, we can say, hey, does a user not exist? Well, then we want to render some stuff here as well. And what we want to render here is just a text value for a link. So it's going to just copy this. And this one is going to be for logging in. So we'll say to login, and the text will say login. All right, so now we have that. Let's go ahead and add it in our layout because we want our nav to be on all of our screens. So we'll just go back into our layout component here and import the nav. And we can go ahead and just put that nav right above this color switcher. So let's just boot up our app again. So we're getting this weird import or error because of this wacky import. I'm not really sure how that happened. Let's go ahead and save that. Okay, so everything looked like it compiled successfully. Let's refresh. So the error that we're getting here is because, again, similar to the Chakra UI, we haven't passed in this auth context yet around our application. So again, we need to head into our index.js file. We need to import our Auth Provider. And then make sure that we wrap our app with that Auth Provider. If we go back, okay, so now we're getting an error that we should not use link outside of a router. Now, this is because we haven't set up our router yet. So in order to get rid of this, we can go back into our app. And in this layout, we want to import, or excuse me, not in layout, but in app.js, we want to import the router from React Router DOM, which is a component. So we'll say import, and it's actually called browser router. And we can import it as and something else as, or name it as something else, but saying as, and then what we want it to be. And this is going to be coming from React Router DOM. So now if we just wrap this in a router, that error should go away. Okay, cool. So now we can see our nav is up here. This takes us to the login page, which doesn't exist yet, and everything else is looking as expected. So now what we can do is go ahead and move on to our forms so we can actually see the forms that we're going to be using to sign in. So let's go ahead and in our components folder, create a new folder called auth. Then in here, we can create a new one called login form.js. And let's go ahead and import everything that we need from React and Chakra. And I'm just going to copy everything we need here from React. And we also are going to be using a library called React Hook Form, which we have not installed yet. So let's go ahead and kill our server and say yarn add React Hook Form. Now let's go ahead and import use form from this new library. And last import we need is our useAuth, because we're going to be using that to handle the login. So we'll say useAuth from that hook. And it looks like I put this auth inside the layout, so let's make sure we put that in the right folder. Okay, then we can go ahead now and create our component. So it's going to be const login form. Then we can go ahead and import or destructure everything we need from useForm here. And that's going to be several things. So one is going to be called handle submit. And let's do equals useForm. So handle submit, register, errors, set error, and form state. Then we're going to get that function we need, or that method we need, off of our custom useAuth, and that's going to be equal to useAuth. Whoops. And the method is called, if I remember, send sign in link to email. Okay. So now let's go ahead and write our onSubmit function, which is going to be used in order to submit our form. And we're going to be using this handle submit from useForm and then passing in this function in there so we can get the data from the form and then use it in order to submit it to this send sign in link to email method. So let's do const onSubmit. We'll do a try catch block. We'll go ahead and catch any error and then display it in the application here in just a few moments. But for now, we want to just go ahead and wait, send sign in link to email. And this onSubmit, like I said, is going to get access to a value called data, which is going to be passed in from handle submit. And we can get the email off of data.email. Then on catch error, what we can do is we can use this set error function from useForm. And the where we want to set this is on the value of email, and then we say what the error is. So we say type. We'll say it's a manual. I spelled that wrong. And the message is on error.message. Now this error message is coming from Firebase. So it's going to catch the error and then it's going to have this message, which is going to be a nice, simple explanation of what's wrong. And then we can use this to display it in our UI. All right, so that's everything for onSubmit. Let's go ahead now and write what we're returning here from this function. So it's going to be a grid item. And this grid item is going to take in the column start and column span, just like the other one that we created. But this time we're going to set in some breakpoints, values for breakpoints in our application. Now out of the box, there are 6 breakpoints, which we need to support with Chakra UI. One is for the base, small, medium, large, extra large, and then 2XL. And the way we do that, if you've ever used something like Emotion, is we can use this really cool way with this array and then just setting the values for each of those. The first one being the smallest and the last one being that 2XL. So the base value is 1. And then for values that we don't want to change, we can just pass in null. So small, medium. On the large, we want it to start on the second column, and then the last 2 values we'll set to null. So now let's go ahead and create the column span, passing in that array. And this is going to span 3 columns on the smallest screen. It's going to keep that all the way up to large screens, which is only going to span 1 column. And then it's going to have that style for all the way up to the largest possible screens. All right, so once we have that, we're just going to add a little bit of padding here by passing in the p tag or the p prop with 6. All right, so we have that new grid item here. And then we can go ahead and use a heading to let people know what this is. And we can say what we want to render this as. We want to render this as an H1 tag. And we can add a margin bottom to the value of 6. And this is just going to say login. Cool. All right, so now we have the heading. We want to do a couple of different things here. And the first thing I'm going to do before I handle some of the showing the values of the form state is just to go ahead and write the form. So first we use this standard form HTML tag, then an onSubmit prop. We pass in that handle submit, which comes from React hook form, and then we pass in our custom onSubmit function. So that is how the onSubmit gets that data value. All right, so once we have that, we want to go ahead and use this this component called form control and a form label, HTML4, and this is going to be for email, and it's going to just say email, okay? Then we want to go ahead and create an input using that input component. The name for this is going to be email. Placeholder, so the text and the little input before we actually type anything is going to say email. And the way we register this with React hook form is to, on the ref prop, just go ahead and call that function called register, and then it's going to handle registering this and tracking the state of this input. And then we just go ahead and close off this input because that's everything we need. And the last thing we want to do is have a submit button. So we're going to use a button component. And let's go ahead and close that off and then put submit. We can say margin top. We can set it to 4. Color scheme. We can pass in a value called teal, which is a default value, which you can read more in the Chakra docs. Is loading is going to be looking at the value of form state. Now, out of the box, form state comes with several different values. One of those is called submitting. So this is going to change depending on whatever value it gets back from React hook form. So we want to show this is loading style if it is submitting. So that's going to handle that for us here. And then we pass in this type, which is going to make sure that this form knows that this is a submit button for the form. So that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and just render this out, make sure everything's looking good in our application. So in order to do that, we want to head back into our app.js file. And we want to import a new thing here from React Router DOM called switch. And while we're at it, let's just go ahead and import route as well, because we'll need that. Now, the switch component is special because what it does is that any routes in the switch component, what it's going to do is it's going to look down and then find whatever component matches that. And this can be a little weird when you're first working with it, because, for example, on your home page, if it has a slash for your home page, well, any component that has a path with a slash in it is also going to be rendered with whatever is also rendered on your home page. There's a prop called exact that we need to pass into in order to just render what for it to be an exact match, which we'll do for the dashboard, but just wanted to mention that before we get to it. So we're going to have that switch component, and we're going to put our layout inside of here. And inside of our layout, we are going to have a new route. This route is going to have a path equal to login. And then inside this route, you just put whatever you want to render. In this case, it's going to be the login form, which we have not imported quite yet. So let's go ahead and import that. Okay, so once we have that, let's go ahead and boot up our app. So we're getting this error because we're using an await and it's not in an async function. So we just need to write async right here. I should get rid of that error. This is not, login form does not have a default export. So let's make sure we actually export this, export default login form. And I wrote this set error wrong. So I wrote it, so email, then it takes this value here as an argument, and then we have the closing bracket here. So that is the correct way to format that. So if we go back, okay, now we can see our login form. And actually, if we submit this, we should see everything. It should go ahead through and we should get that email. Now we're not showing it in the UI quite yet. So let's go ahead and check my email. You can see here that we're getting this link, which we can click through. It's going to take us to our application. But right now we don't have a form for our confirm, so that's not going to actually do anything quite yet. All right, so let's go ahead now and handle the UI showing when a form is submitted or if there's any errors. And we can use the alert component from Chakra UI in order to do that. So beneath this heading, what I want to do is first, from errors, which is a value that is coming from use form, we can look if the certain values that we pass into the form. So for in this case, email, if there are any, we can go ahead and render something. So what we want to render is we want to render an alert and then style it to look like an arrow alert. So we say alert status. So this is how we pass in the coloring. We can have a variant. We'll have a variant called subtle. We can add a margin top as 6, a margin bottom as 6. Then we can say alert icon. And then we can go ahead and pass in the error message, which comes from errors.email.message. And that message is the one that comes in from Google or from Firebase. So we're getting an error here. So I have a typo. Okay. Now let's go ahead and do one for if the form has been successfully submitted, and we can get that value off of form state dot is submit successful. So if an error runs, this is not going to be true. So we know that this is only going to run when it's successfully submitted. And what we want to render here is something very similar. So I'm just going to copy this alert, paste it here. The status here is going to be success. The variant is still subtle. These values are still the same. And we want to just have a default, say check your email to complete login. Let's go ahead and save that. Okay, so everything there looks good. Let's head back into our app. We can see that is, we're now seeing that. So let's just refresh it. Let's go ahead and put in a wrong email. So improperly formatted. Your email address is badly formatted. Perfect. And let's go ahead and submit a good one. Here we go. Check your email to complete login. Perfect. So now that we have the login form complete, let's go ahead now and move on to our confirm form, which is going to, again, ask for an email, but we're going to be clicking that through our the email that's sent in from Firebase. It's just going to have a special URL that we pass into Firebase in order to finalize authentication. So in our auth folder, let's go ahead and create a new file called confirmform.js. And this one is going to be very similar to the other one. So I'm just going to copy the login form and just change everything that we need to change in here. So scroll to the top and make sure that everything here is what we need. And we are going to be importing a couple things from React Router DOM. So let's go ahead and import those. One is called useHistory. And this is what we're going to use in order to send someone back to the dashboard once they're logged in. Then we're going to use a hook called useLocation, which we're going to use in order to get that value that we need to send off to Firebase, which is going to hold all the stuff it needs to finalize authentication. And that is going to be coming from React Router DOM. All right, so let's go ahead and scroll down here. All this is the same. We need to go ahead and call those hooks. So const history equals use history. And then const location is use location. All right, so the on submit, we're going to change this. So it's not going to await this function. Instead, it's going to await, and we need to change that here, sign in with email link. So it's going to await this. It needs the email, and it needs that value. So if I still have this up, I actually don't, but we have this value here on our confirm page. If I click through, it should still be there actually. So all of this stuff after this question mark, we can get off by just off of location by saying location .search. And then we can just send that over to Firebase. Firebase will automatically parse it for us, get the information it needs, and then finalize the authentication. Then if that is good, we can just go ahead and send the user back to the home page, which is going to be a private route once we finish all of this. And on the error, we're going to have it set to the same thing. So nothing here is actually changing. All of this is the same, except we want this to say confirm email. We're not going to have a success message on this. We're just going to redirect them if it's successful. So we just go ahead and get rid of this. This one is the same. Okay. And obviously this is a confirm form. Make sure we actually did that up here too. Confirm form. And let's go ahead and save that. All right, so now that we have this, let's go ahead and use it. Make sure it's in our route. So we'll say route path equals /confirm. And then we can say confirm form. Okay, so now our entire process should now work, and we should be able to sign in, save that user on that provider, and then use it, as an authenticated user. So let's go ahead and see if this is still valid. So we have to enter in the same email that we did before. Click on submit. All right, so it's invalid. So it could be malformed, expired, or already been used. So let's just try this process again. Check our email. Okay. All right, so we're logged in because we can see now that this says log out. So if we inspect this and using the React Chrome tools, we can go ahead and look up auth. We have this state value now with all of this freaking information that comes back on the user object from Firebase. So you can see that all the stuff here that we can use in our application and that we'll need for Firebase. Okay, so that is working. Now what we need to do is create a private route, which is actually really simple. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a, let's actually create a component here, or excuse me, a folder. Let's call this route. And inside here, we'll create a new file called private route.js. And this is obviously going to use React. And it's also going to be using route and the redirect component from React Router DOM. And last, it's going to use that useAuth hook. Then we can go ahead and create our function or our component. This is going to be passed in children, and then any other props we pass in, we can just use the spread syntax to just go ahead and spread those out so we get access to them. Then we're going to get the user object off of auth. Then we're going to return what we need here, and that's just going to be a route. And on this route, we can pass in some props. So what we can say is just go ahead and expand the rest. So anything we pass in here is just going to be passed in automatically. And then there's this one called render, which allows us to conditionally render something. So what we can do is say, is there a user? Well, if there is a user, go ahead and render the children. Otherwise, if there's not a user, then go ahead and render the redirect component and redirect the user to the login page. So we save that and then export it. That should be everything for that. And then we can come in, and we don't have a dashboard component yet, but we do have private routes. So let's do a private route to, excuse me, not to, but path is going to just be a /. And remember, because technically this login has a /. It would also render the login form. So what we can do is pass in a prop called exact, meaning that only render something, only render this if it has exactly the home page. And we can render whatever we want. So we can just say something like p tag says hello. So if we save that, now we will see hello. So this is, if we log out and try to go to the home page, we'll be redirected back to the login. So that is working as expected. And what we're going to do now is just go ahead and create a new component for our dashboard. So let's go ahead and create that folder, create a new file. Then we can, this is going to be a really simple component here. We can get our user object. Go ahead and return a first thing is the grid item. We're going to go ahead and just pass in the props here for our column start. And this is very similar to, it's actually exact same as the columns for the form. And we're going to have a heading, heading, and we're going to render that as a heading 1. Add a margin bottom. And this is just going to have a heading of dashboard. And then what we can do is we can go ahead and use that user object to display something useful. For instance, we can say hello and then the email. So we can use text, font, not test, but text, font size, large. And we can say welcome, comma, and then we can get the email off of user.email. Let's go ahead and save that and make sure we export it as a default export. Then let's go back into our app, and instead of this hello, let's go ahead and render out that dashboard. And make sure we import it. So it looks like we have that weird import again up here. I'm not sure why that keeps happening. Make sure that this is React. Okay, so let's go ahead and log in here. There we go. Welcome, Hunter at hunterbecton.com. And it looks like everything is working. And one other thing we could do in here is to make sure that on any routes that don't exist in our application, we need to handle those. So let's go ahead and just create a new route here at the bottom. This one is not going to have a path, but instead it's just going to have, let's import a heading. Go ahead and import a heading from Chakra, and we'll import a grid item. And I can just say, let's copy this grid item and this heading. Just past it, oops. Need that closing grid item tag. We say 404 page not found. Okay, so, and the reason we're getting this issue is because this layout needs to be outside of this switch statement. Okay, so now that 404 that wasn't supposed to be there, it goes away. Let's go ahead and enter a page that doesn't exist. Cool, and then we get that 404 page not found. All right, so if you want a deeper dive, including written explanations, code examples, and step-by-step videos, check out the Firebase React guide on skillthrive.com. The link is in the description. You'll learn about styled components, form validation with Yup and React Hook forms, reCAPTCHA, custom password reset flow, toaster notifications, and more. Your support is greatly appreciated, and I'll see you in the next one.